The snowplow hadn't come through our street in 3 days, and I was the only idiot still going outside at 5 in the morning to help dig out my neighbors' cars in our subdivision in Buffalo, New York. My name is Jason Patterson, and I had been living in the Meadowbrook Heights community for exactly 8 months when everything fell apart that frigid January morning. I moved here after my divorce, thinking a fresh start in a planned community would be peaceful. The townhouse was perfect, the neighbors seemed friendly enough, and I didn't mind the HOA fees since they supposedly covered snow removal and landscaping. What I didn't know was that our HOA president, Barbara Mitchell, had the personality of a porcupine and the temperament of a prison warden. That morning started like any other winter day in western New York. I woke up at 4:30, made my coffee, and looked out my front window to see another 6 inches of fresh powder covering everything. My truck was buried again, just like every other vehicle on Oakwood Drive. I bundled up in my Carhartt jacket, pulled on my insulated boots, and headed outside with my shovel. The cold hit me like a physical force. 20 degrees below zero with the wind chill, and my breath formed ice crystals in the air almost instantly. I started my Ford F-250 with my remote starter from inside, letting it warm up while I began clearing the driveway. The engine rumbled to life, a comforting sound in the pre-dawn silence. I had learned my first week here that the HOA's snow removal service was basically worthless. They'd show up eventually, usually by noon, and do a half-hearted job on the main roads. The side streets and driveways were left to us residents. Since I had a truck, a good snowblower, and apparently more free time than most of my neighbors who commuted to Rochester or worked from home, I started helping out. First, I cleared my own driveway and walkway. Then I moved to Mrs. Henderson's townhouse next door. She was 73, widowed, and could barely lift a bag of groceries, let alone operate a snow shovel. After hers, I did the Ramirez family's place across the street. Miguel worked night shifts as an ER nurse and got home around 6 in the morning. His wife Rachel had their 3 kids to get ready for school. They needed the help. By the time the sun started rising, I had cleared 6 driveways and was working on my 7th. My truck was still running in my driveway, the exhaust creating white clouds in the freezing air. I had been out there for over an hour, and my back was starting to protest. That's when I saw Barbara's silver Lexus creeping down the street, moving slowly through the snow. She lived in the largest unit at the end of our row, a corner lot with an attached 2-car garage. I had met her exactly twice. Both times she had been complaining about something. First about someone's trash cans being visible from the street on a non-collection day. Then about the Ramirez kids' basketball hoop being 2 inches over the property line. She pulled up next to my still-running truck and rolled down her window. Barbara was in her early 50s, with short blonde hair that looked professionally styled even at 6 in the morning, and she wore a puffy white coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Excuse me, Jason," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I walked over, my shovel still in hand. "Morning, Barbara. What can I do for you? Your vehicle has been idling in your driveway for over an hour," she said, not even bothering with pleasantries. "That's a direct violation of HOA regulations, Section 7, Paragraph 3, which clearly states that no vehicle shall be left running unattended for more than 10 minutes. I stared at her, convinced I had misheard. "I'm sorry, what? Your truck, it's been idling. That's a violation." She held up her phone, showing me what looked like a photo of my driveway with a timestamp. "I've documented it. You'll be receiving a formal fine in the mail, $50 for the first offense. Barbara, it's -20 degrees out here. I'm clearing everyone's driveways." My truck needs to stay warm, and honestly, so do I when I take breaks. The rules are the rules, Jason. Everyone has to follow them equally. If I let you slide, then I have to let everyone slide, and then we have chaos." She said the word chaos like she was describing the apocalypse. "I've been out here for over an hour helping our neighbors," I said, gesturing to the cleared driveways behind me. "Mrs. Henderson can't do this herself. The Ramirez family has 3 kids to get to school. I'm trying to help." "That's very noble, but it doesn't exempt you from the regulations. You signed the HOA agreement when you purchased your property. Ignorance of the rules isn't an excuse." Her window started rolling up. "Have a good day, Jason. Watch your mail." She drove off, leaving me standing there in the freezing cold, holding my shovel like an idiot. I should have seen it as a warning sign. I should have just paid the stupid fine and moved on. But something about the absolute absurdity of the situation hit me wrong. I had been waking up before dawn for weeks, helping people I barely knew, asking for nothing in return, and this was the thanks I got. A fine for trying to keep my truck from freezing solid while I performed unpaid community service. I finished clearing the driveway I was working on, then put my equipment away and went inside. My hands were numb despite my gloves, and my face felt like it might crack if I smiled. I took a hot shower, got dressed for work, and headed to my job at the construction supply company I managed in Cheektowaga. The fine arrived 4 days later, just like Barbara promised. It was printed on official-looking letterhead with the Meadowbrook Heights HOA logo at the top. $50 for unauthorized extended vehicle idling in violation of environmental and noise regulations. There was even a grainy photo printed on the notice showing my truck in my driveway with the exhaust visible. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, reading through the 3-page document that accompanied the fine. Apparently, our HOA had dozens of regulations I had never bothered to fully review when I bought the place. My lawyer had assured me everything was standard, and I trusted him. Now, I was reading about restrictions on everything from what color flowers you could plant to how long you could leave your garage door open to when you were allowed to run your vehicle in your own driveway. The kicker was the appeals process. If I wanted to contest the fine, I had to submit a written appeal to the HOA board within 10 days, then appear at the next monthly meeting to present my case. The next meeting wasn't for 3 weeks. In the meantime, the fine would continue to accumulate late fees if I didn't pay. I had 2 choices: pay $50 for the privilege of helping my neighbors, or fight it and potentially pay more. I paid the fine. But I made a decision that night while sitting at my kitchen table, eating leftover Chinese food and watching the snow fall outside my window. If the HOA wanted to fine me for warming my truck while I helped everyone else, then I simply wouldn't help everyone else anymore. Problem solved. The next morning, I woke up at my normal time. I made my coffee, looked outside at the fresh 4 inches of snow, and started my truck with the remote starter. Then I went back inside and waited exactly 10 minutes. I set a timer on my phone to be sure. At 9 minutes and 50 seconds, I walked outside and began clearing my driveway. Only my driveway. I didn't look at Mrs. Henderson's snow-covered walkway. I didn't glance across the street at the Ramirez family's buried car. I cleared my own property line, scraped off my truck, and went back inside. The whole process took 25 minutes instead of my usual 2 hours. Mrs. Henderson knocked on my door around 8 that morning. I had already left for work. She called my cell phone around 9. "Jason, honey, I hate to bother you, but I can't get out to my doctor's appointment. The snow is too deep, and I was wondering if you might have time later to help me clear my walkway." I know you usually do it in the morning, and I don't know what happened today. I felt like garbage. I'm sorry, Mrs. Henderson. I'm actually not going to be able to help with snow removal anymore. I got fined by the HOA for warming my truck while I was shoveling, so I've decided it's better if I just handle my own property. There was a long pause. They fined you for helping people, for warming my truck. Apparently, it's against the rules to let it idle for more than 10 minutes. That's ridiculous. Barbara drives around this neighborhood all morning with her car running, watching everyone like a hawk. I've seen her sitting in her driveway with the car on for half an hour. I don't make the rules, Mrs. Henderson. I'm sorry. You might want to call the HOA office about the snow removal service we're supposed to be getting. She thanked me quietly and hung up. I felt terrible, but I wasn't going to keep getting fined for being helpful. Miguel Ramirez called me that afternoon. Hey man, everything okay? Rachel said your driveway was clear this morning, but nobody else's was. We kind of had a rough morning getting the kids out the door. Had to call her mom to come help dig us out. I explained the situation to him. He was silent for a moment, then let out a long breath. Man, that's messed up. You were doing us a huge favor all this time. I didn't realize you were getting up that early just to help everyone out. It wasn't a big deal. I was doing my own anyway, but I can't afford to keep getting fined by the HOA, so I'm just going to stick to my property from now on. I get it. That's fair. Barbara is something else, isn't she? We got fined last month because our Halloween decorations were still up on November 2nd. Apparently, all seasonal decorations have to be removed within 24 hours of the holiday ending. Cost us $75. We commiserated for a few more minutes, then hung up. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The neighborhood deteriorated quickly. Without me clearing driveways every morning, people were stuck. The HOA's snow removal service was contracted to a company called Premier Property Services, and they were absolutely useless. They'd show up around noon, make one pass down the main road with their plow and leave. Side streets were barely touched. Driveways were never cleared. Mrs. Henderson missed 2 doctor's appointments that week because she couldn't get her car out. The Ramirez kids were late to school 3 times. Other neighbors I had been helping started falling behind on their own snow removal because they had gotten used to my assistance, and it kept snowing. Buffalo was having one of its worst winters in a decade, and we were getting hit with a fresh storm every 2 or 3 days. By the end of the second week, I started getting hostile looks from some of my neighbors. I overheard Rachel Ramirez talking to another neighbor, saying something about how some people just stop caring about community. I wanted to explain, to defend myself, but what was the point? I had tried to help, and I got punished for it. The HOA board meeting was on a Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. They held it in the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that also housed a fitness room and a mailbox area. I didn't plan on attending. I had paid my fine and changed my behavior. As far as I was concerned, the matter was closed. Barbara had other ideas. I received a formal notice in my mailbox on Tuesday, informing me that I was being fined an additional $200 for failure to maintain clear and safe pedestrian access on property during winter conditions. I read the notice 3 times before I understood what they were claiming. Apparently, because snow from my driveway had been pushed to the side and had partially drifted onto the sidewalk that ran along our street, I was creating a safety hazard. Never mind that the sidewalk was completely covered in snow anyway, because the HOA's service didn't clear sidewalks. Never mind that literally every other house on the street had the same issue. I called the HOA office. A bored-sounding woman named Stephanie answered. Hi, I'm calling about a fine I received. Jason Patterson, Unit 47 on Oakwood Drive. One moment. I heard keyboard clicking. Yes, I see it here. $200 fine for sidewalk obstruction. I'm confused about this. Everyone on my street has snow on the sidewalks. Why am I being singled out? I don't have that information, sir. You need to speak to a board member about the specifics of your violation. Can I speak to Barbara Mitchell? Mrs. Mitchell doesn't take calls. You can email her through the HOA website or attend the next board meeting. The meeting is tomorrow. Yes, sir. 7 p.m. at the clubhouse. And if I want to dispute this fine, you can present your case at the meeting. You'll need to submit a written request to be added to the agenda at least 24 hours in advance. I hung up and immediately typed out an email requesting to be added to the agenda. I kept it professional and brief, just stating that I wanted to dispute the recent fine and explain the circumstances. I got an auto reply from Barbara's email saying she would respond within 3 business days. The meeting was in less than 2. That night, I pulled out my HOA documents and actually read them cover to cover. It took me 3 hours and 2 beers, but I made it through all 47 pages of regulations, bylaws, and amendments. What I discovered made my blood boil. The vehicle idling rule was real, but it had been amended 6 months before I moved in. The amendment included an exception for necessary vehicle warming during extreme weather conditions, defined as temperatures below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The morning I was fined, the temperature had been -20 with wind chill, well below the threshold. The sidewalk maintenance rule was also real, but it specifically stated that homeowners were only responsible for sidewalks that crossed their property, not public sidewalks along the street. Those were supposed to be maintained by the HOA's snow removal service. Barbara had either not read her own rules, or she was deliberately misapplying them. I showed up to the HOA meeting 15 minutes early with a folder full of printed documents. My fine notices, weather reports from the day in question, photos of other properties with similar snow conditions, and highlighted copies of the relevant HOA regulations. The clubhouse was already half full when I arrived. I recognized most of the faces from around the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson was there, sitting near the back with her cane across her lap. Miguel and Rachel Ramirez were there with their oldest daughter. Several other neighbors I had been helping were scattered around the room. Barbara sat at a table at the front with 4 other board members. A thin man in his 60s who I didn't recognize, a heavy-set woman with gray hair, a younger guy in a business suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and a middle-aged woman with glasses who was typing on a laptop. Barbara called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m. She went through standard opening procedures, then started with old business, approval of last month's minutes, financial reports, update on the playground equipment repair that had been pending since fall. 45 minutes passed before they got to new business. I had not received a response to my email, and I wasn't on the printed agenda that had been handed out when I arrived. Barbara started going through new items. A proposal to increase HOA fees by $15 per month, a discussion about updating the community entrance sign, a complaint about someone's barking dog. I raised my hand. Barbara looked at me like I had just interrupted a church service. Yes. I submitted a request yesterday to be added to the agenda. I need to dispute 2 fines I received. I didn't receive any such request, she said flatly. I sent an email to the address listed on the HOA website, hoapresident@meadowbrookheights.org. The woman with the laptop leaned over and whispered something to Barbara. Barbara's expression soured further. "It appears your email went to spam," she said. Unfortunately, without proper notice, we can't add items to the agenda during the meeting. You'll need to submit your dispute for next month's meeting. Next month. My fines are accumulating late fees. I'm being charged for violations that I don't believe are accurate. Can we at least discuss this briefly? The rules exist for a reason, Mr. Patterson. We can't simply change procedures because it's inconvenient for one resident. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me. Mrs. Henderson stood up in the back, her cane thumping against the floor. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Barbara. The man is standing right here. Just let him talk for 5 minutes." Several other people murmured in agreement. Barbara's jaw tightened. "This is highly irregular." "So is fining someone for helping their neighbors," Mrs. Henderson shot back. The room got very quiet. Barbara stared at Mrs. Henderson for a long moment, then turned to the other board members. The thin man shrugged. The woman with glasses nodded slightly. The guy in the suit was checking his phone. "Fine," Barbara said. "You have 5 minutes, Mr. Patterson. Please keep it brief." I walked to the front of the room and laid out my case as clearly as I could. I explained that I had been waking up early to help clear driveways for elderly residents and families with young children. I showed the weather reports proving the temperature was well below the threshold for the idling exception. I pointed out the section of the HOA regulations that supported my position. Then, I addressed the sidewalk fine. I showed photos of at least a dozen other properties with identical conditions, and read aloud the regulations specifying that street-side sidewalks were the HOA's responsibility, not individual homeowners. "I'm not trying to cause problems," I concluded. "I just want to understand why I'm being fined for things that either don't violate the actual regulations or are identical to situations elsewhere in the neighborhood that aren't being penalized." Barbara waited until I was finished, then cleared her throat. "Mr. Patterson, while I appreciate your passion, you're misinterpreting the regulations. The vehicle idling exception requires pre-approval from the board for specific dates and times. You didn't request approval, therefore the exception doesn't apply." I flipped through my copy of the regulations. "Where does it say that?" Section 7, Paragraph 3, Subsection B. I read it aloud. "Property owners may warm vehicles during extreme weather conditions as defined in Section 2 without penalty, provided such warming does not create excessive noise or environmental hazard." I looked up. "There's nothing here about pre-approval." "That's an older version," Barbara said smoothly. "The regulations were updated last quarter. The current version requires board approval for exemptions. I never received notice of that update. All updates are posted on the HOA website. Residents are responsible for staying informed." The thin man next to her shifted uncomfortably. "Barbara, I don't remember voting on that amendment." She shot him a look that could have melted steel. "It was approved via email vote in November. I have the records in my files." "I'd like to see those records," I said. "They're not available for public review." Board communications are confidential unless there's a formal challenge process initiated. This was getting nowhere. I could feel my frustration building, but I kept my voice level. "What about the sidewalk fine? Can you explain how I'm responsible for a public sidewalk that your contracted service is supposed to maintain? The sidewalk in question crosses your property line. That makes it your responsibility." "No, it doesn't. The sidewalk runs parallel to the street along the entire row of townhouses. It doesn't cross any individual property." Barbara pulled out her own folder and produced a plot map. "According to county records, the public easement technically includes a portion of each resident's property. Therefore, you're responsible for maintenance." "Then why isn't everyone else being fined?" I have photos showing identical conditions on at least 15 other properties. We investigate and enforce violations as we become aware of them. If other properties are in violation, they'll be addressed in due course. I realized what was happening. This wasn't about rules or regulations or community standards. This was personal. Barbara had decided I was a problem, and she was using her position to harass me. So you're saying that you just happened to notice my property specifically, out of all the identical properties on this street, and decided to enforce a regulation that nobody else is following. I'm saying that violations are addressed as they are reported or observed. If you have concerns about other properties, you're welcome to file formal complaints, and the board will investigate them with the same diligence we investigate all matters. Mrs. Henderson stood up again. This is nonsense, Barbara, and everyone in this room knows it. Jason was the only person helping anyone with snow removal until you find him. Now my car's been stuck for 2 weeks, and I've missed medical appointments. The Ramirez children have been late to school multiple times, all because you decided to punish someone for being a good neighbor. Mrs. Henderson, please sit down. Your outburst is out of order. I'll stand if I want to stand. I'm 73 years old and I've lived in this community for 12 years. I've watched you turn this HOA into your personal kingdom and I'm tired of it. So is everyone else here. Several people applauded. Rachel Ramirez stood up next to Mrs. Henderson. Then Miguel stood. Then a man I didn't know from 3 houses down. Within 30 seconds, half the room was on their feet. Barbara's face turned red. Everyone please sit down or I'll adjourn this meeting immediately. Then adjourn it, Mrs. Henderson said. Because we're not sitting down until you drop these ridiculous fines and let Jason clear his truck in peace. The thin man next to Barbara leaned toward her and whispered something. She shook her head sharply. He whispered again, more insistently. The woman with glasses had stopped typing and was watching the standing residents with wide eyes. Finally, Barbara spoke. The board will take Mr. Patterson's dispute under advisement and issue a decision within 30 days. In the meantime, the fines are suspended pending review. Is that acceptable? No, Mrs. Henderson said. Drop the fines now. I don't have the authority to unilaterally dismiss fines without a board vote. Then take a vote, right now. We're all here. Barbara looked like she wanted to argue further, but the thin man spoke up. I move that we dismiss both fines against Mr. Patterson based on the evidence and testimony presented tonight. I second that motion, the woman with glasses said quickly. Barbara glared at both of them. All in favor? 3 hands went up. The thin man, the woman with glasses, and the heavy-set woman with gray hair. The guy in the suit didn't look up from his phone. Motion passes, the thin man said. The fines are dismissed. Barbara gathered her papers with sharp, angry movements. Is there any other business before this board tonight? Silence. Then this meeting is adjourned. She stood and walked out of the clubhouse without another word. The room erupted in conversation. People came up to me, shaking my hand and thanking me for standing up to Barbara. Mrs. Henderson hugged me, which was awkward but sweet. Miguel clapped me on the shoulder and invited me over for dinner the next night. I felt vindicated but also uneasy. I had a feeling this wasn't over. I was right. 3 days later, I received another notice from the HOA. This time, it was a warning of pattern violations, claiming that I had multiple infractions on record, and that further violations would result in escalating fines and potential legal action. The listed infractions were absurd. My garbage can have been visible from the street on a non-collection day. I had taken it out the night before pickup, which was standard. My exterior light fixture was allegedly not matching the approved community standards. It was the original fixture that came with the townhouse, and I had failed to submit my updated vehicle registration information to the HOA office. I didn't even know that was required. I wasn't the only one. Mrs. Henderson received a violation notice for her mailbox being improperly maintained because the post was slightly weathered. The Ramirez family got hit with a fine for their basketball hoop again, claiming it was now 4 inches over the property line instead of 2. At least 5 other people who had supported me at the meeting received similar harassment notices. Barbara was retaliating, and she wasn't being subtle about it. I spent my weekend researching New York HOA law and reading through forums of people dealing with similar situations. What I discovered was both encouraging and frustrating. HOAs had a lot of power, but they weren't unlimited. Board members could be removed through a vote of the community. Regulations could be challenged if they weren't being enforced fairly or if they violated state law. Homeowners had rights. But exercising those rights required organization, time, and often money for legal fees. On Monday evening, I knocked on Mrs. Henderson's door. She invited me in for tea, and we sat in her cozy living room discussing the situation. "She's trying to force you out," Mrs. Henderson said bluntly. "I've seen her do it before. There was a young couple 3 years ago, the Johnsons. Nice people, had a baby. Barbara decided she didn't like them parking their second car on the street overnight. Started fining them, harassing them, making their life miserable. They sold their place and moved within 6 months. Why? What does she get out of it? Control. Barbara likes things a certain way, and anyone who challenges her becomes a target. She's been HOA president for 8 years. Nobody runs against her because nobody wants the headache, and anyone who does cross her gets the same treatment you're getting now. There has to be something we can do." "There is. We vote her out. Next election is in March, 2 months from now. We find someone willing to run against her and we make sure everyone votes." "Would you run?" She laughed, a dry chuckle that turned into a cough. "Honey, I'm 73 with arthritis and high blood pressure. I can barely manage my own house, but I know someone who might." Over the next week, Mrs. Henderson and I quietly talked to other residents. We found out that the frustration with Barbara went far deeper than I had realized. She had been fining people for minor infractions, misusing HOA funds for personal projects like upgrading her own unit's landscaping, and ignoring legitimate complaints about the services we were supposed to be receiving. The contracted snow removal service, for example, was owned by Barbara's brother-in-law. They were being paid $12,000 per season to maintain the roads and sidewalks, but they were doing maybe 20% of the actual work. When residents complained, Barbara dismissed them or claimed the service was adequate. The more we dug, the worse it got. We found out that Barbara had been approving contracts without proper board votes, had been collecting kickbacks from vendors, and had even been using HOA funds to pay for her personal legal fees in a dispute completely unrelated to the community. Miguel Ramirez was an ER nurse, but he had a background in accounting. He volunteered to go through the HOA's financial records, which were supposed to be available to any homeowner upon request. When he asked for them, Barbara refused, claiming they were in the middle of an audit and couldn't be released. That was a lie. New York law required HOAs to make financial records available to members within 10 business days of a written request. Barbara was breaking the law. Miguel filed a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office. That got Barbara's attention. 2 weeks before the election, I came home from work to find my truck's windshield smashed. The glass was everywhere, and someone had spray-painted "Leave" across my hood in red paint. I called the police and filed a report. The officer who responded was sympathetic but realistic about the chances of catching whoever did it. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked, taking photos of the damage. "I have suspicions, but no proof." "HOA dispute. How did you know?" He smiled grimly. "This is my fourth call this month about property damage in planned communities. HOA disputes are getting nasty everywhere. People think they can get away with this stuff because it's just neighbors." I gave him the whole story about Barbara and the fines and the retaliation. He took notes and said he'd include it in his report, but without evidence directly connecting Barbara to the vandalism, there wasn't much they could do. The insurance covered most of the damage, but I was out my $500 deductible and had to drive a rental car for a week while the repairs were done. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for 2 days before the election. I attended with about 30 other residents, which was unprecedented. The clubhouse was standing room only. Barbara opened the meeting with her usual cold efficiency, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She knew something was coming. During new business, Mrs. Henderson stood up and addressed the board. "I'd like to make a motion to hold a special vote to remove Barbara Mitchell as HOA president for cause, effective immediately." The room went silent. Barbara's face went white, then red. "That's not how this works. Elections are held annually in March. If residents want new leadership, they can vote then." The thin man from the board, whose name I had learned was Donald Schmidt, spoke up. "Actually, Barbara, the bylaws do allow for removal of officers for cause through a special vote, provided that cause is demonstrated and the vote receives a 2/3 majority of homeowners." "This is ridiculous." "What cause?" Miguel stood up holding a folder. "Misappropriation of HOA funds, awarding contracts to family members without proper disclosure or competitive bidding, refusing to provide financial records as required by state law, selective enforcement of regulations as retaliation against residents, and using HOA funds for personal legal matters. I have documentation for all of it." He walked to the front and handed the folder to Donald Schmidt, who began reading through it. The woman with glasses leaned over to look as well. Even the guy in the suit put down his phone and paid attention. Barbara snatched the folder from Donald's hands. "This is private board business. You have no right to these documents." "They're not board documents," Miguel said calmly. "They're copies of invoices, payment records, and emails that were provided to me by vendors and contractors who got tired of not being paid on time because you were using HOA money for other things. Everything there is verifiable through public records and bank statements, which you're legally required to provide and have been refusing to do." Barbara stood up so fast her chair fell backward. "This meeting is over. Everyone leave. Now." "You can't adjourn the meeting without a vote," Donald said, still reading through the documents. "And based on what I'm seeing here, I think we need to discuss this. Barbara, did you really use $3,000 of HOA money to pay your divorce attorney last year?" "That was a mistake. My bookkeeper corrected it." "There's no record of any correction. The money was withdrawn and never returned." The woman with glasses was looking at her laptop now, pulling up the HOA's financial records that she apparently had access to. "Donald's right. There's no offsetting transaction. And look at this. We paid Premier Property Services $12,000 for snow removal, but I'm showing invoices from them for only $4,500 in actual work completed. Where did the other $7,500 go?" Barbara grabbed for the laptop, but the woman pulled it away. "Don't touch this, Barbara. I'm looking through everything now, and there are a lot of discrepancies." Things escalated quickly from there. The board members started arguing among themselves while residents shouted questions and accusations. Someone called the police when Barbara tried to physically remove Miguel from the room. 2 officers showed up and managed to calm everyone down enough to get statements. By the end of the night, Barbara had resigned her position as HOA president effective immediately. The entire board had voted to conduct a full audit of the HOA's finances, and several residents had stated their intention to pursue legal action against Barbara personally for the misappropriated funds. I drove home that night feeling exhausted but relieved. It was finally over, except it wasn't. The full audit took 6 weeks and revealed that Barbara had embezzled over $37,000 from the HOA over the past 3 years through various schemes. Inflated service contracts with family members, personal charges disguised as HOA expenses, and outright transfer of funds to her personal accounts for things like her car payments, vacation expenses, and credit card bills. The district attorney's office got involved. Barbara was arrested and charged with multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and grand larceny. Her bail was set at $50,000, which she posted through a bondsman, but the legal proceedings were just beginning. The civil suits came next. The HOA itself filed suit to recover the stolen funds. Individual homeowners who had been unfairly fined or faced retaliation filed their own suits. Mrs. Henderson filed a harassment claim. The Ramirez family joined a class action with several other families who had been systematically targeted. I was called to testify in multiple proceedings over the following months. It was time-consuming and stressful, but also cathartic. Every time I had to recount how Barbara had fined me for warming my truck while I helped my neighbors, I saw the absurdity of it reflected in other people's faces. Judges, lawyers, jury members, they all got it. What she had done was petty, vindictive, and ultimately criminal. The criminal trial happened in late June. I attended as much as I could, taking time off from work to sit in the courtroom and watch justice unfold. The evidence was overwhelming. Barbara's defense attorney tried to argue that she had simply made bookkeeping errors, that the financial management of the HOA was complex, and mistakes happened. The prosecution systematically destroyed that argument. They showed intentional patterns of deception, evidence of Barbara creating false invoices, records of her deleting emails, and attempting to hide transactions. They brought in the vendors and contractors, who testified that Barbara had approached them about kickback schemes. They presented bank records showing the exact flow of money from the HOA accounts to Barbara's personal accounts. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing came a month later. The judge was not sympathetic. Barbara received 4 years in state prison, was ordered to pay full restitution of the embezzled funds plus penalties and interest, and was permanently banned from serving on any HOA or similar organizations board in New York State. As she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, I felt no satisfaction, just a deep weariness. None of this had needed to happen. If she had just let me warm my truck and clear my neighbors' driveways, none of us would be here. Life in Meadowbrook Heights slowly returned to something resembling normal. Donald Schmidt served as interim HOA president until the special election in August. A retired teacher named Patricia Morrison won the position and immediately set about implementing reforms. Financial transparency, fair enforcement of regulations, proper vendor oversight, and a complete rewrite of the more absurd rules. The vehicle idling restriction was modified to allow reasonable warming periods during extreme weather. The sidewalk maintenance responsibility was clarified to match state law. Dozens of other minor regulations that existed only to give the board power to harass residents were eliminated or revised. The new board hired a legitimate snow removal service that actually did their job. When winter came around again the following year, our streets were properly plowed and sidewalks were cleared. I still woke up early sometimes to help Mrs. Henderson or the Ramirez family, but now I could warm my truck without fear of being fined. Mrs. Henderson lived to see the changes take hold. She passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 winters after Barbara's conviction, at the age of 75. The entire neighborhood attended her funeral. She had been the catalyst for standing up to Barbara, and none of us forgot it. Miguel and Rachel Ramirez became good friends of mine. Their kids grew up, and I watched them graduate from elementary school to middle school to high school. Miguel eventually became a board member himself, serving 2 terms and helping maintain the community standards Patricia Morrison had established. As for me, I learned some valuable lessons about HOAs, community living, and standing up for what's right even when it's inconvenient. I learned that helping your neighbors is always worth it, even if it costs you something. I learned that bullies exist in all forms, even middle-aged women in expensive coats driving Lexuses through suburban neighborhoods. And I learned that sometimes, refusing to help people who take your help for granted is the wake-up call everyone needs. I still live in Meadowbrook Heights. My townhouse is paid off now, and I have no plans to leave. The community is genuinely nice these days, the kind of place I thought I was moving to all those years ago when I signed the purchase papers and didn't read the HOA regulations carefully enough. On cold winter mornings when the snow is falling and the temperature drops below 0, I still start my truck and let it warm up. But now I do it without looking over my shoulder, without setting a timer, without fear of seeing a silver Lexus creeping down the street with a phone camera pointed at my driveway. And when I grab my shovel and head out to clear my driveway, I often find that Miguel is already outside doing his, and we work together, moving from house to house, helping the elderly residents and the families with young kids, being the neighbors we always should have been. No fines. No harassment. No retaliation. Just people helping people on a cold morning in Buffalo, New York. That's the way it should be. That's the way it is now. Barbara served her full 4-year sentence in Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. She was released on parole in the spring, moved to Florida to live with her sister, and as far as I know, never returned to New York. The restitution payments were set up on a payment plan that will probably take her the rest of her life to complete, but that's not my problem anymore. The HOA recovered most of the stolen funds through the criminal restitution and the civil suits. The money was used to make long overdue repairs to common areas, upgrade the playground equipment, and build up a proper reserve fund for future expenses. Property values in Meadowbrook Heights actually increased over the following years, partly because word got around that we had cleaned house and had become one of the better-run communities in the area. Every now and then, when I'm sitting in my living room on a quiet evening, I think about that first morning when Barbara pulled up in her Lexus and informed me that I was being fined for warming my truck. I think about how a simple act of pettiness set off a chain of events that ended with criminal convictions, prison time, and the complete restructuring of our community's governance. I think about how differently things might have gone if I had just kept helping everyone after that first fine, if I had just paid it quietly and moved on. Would Barbara have continued her embezzlement unchallenged? Would she have driven out more residents who dared to question her? How much longer would she have gotten away with it, in a strange way? Her decision to fine me for warming my truck was the beginning of the end for her. My decision to stop helping everyone else forced the community to confront how dependent they had become on someone they barely knew, someone who was waking up hours before dawn in sub-zero temperatures just to be kind. When I stopped, they noticed. When they noticed, they started asking questions. When they started asking questions, the whole rotten structure came tumbling down. I don't consider myself a hero. I was just a guy trying to help his neighbors who got tired of being punished for it. But I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop accepting unacceptable treatment. Stop enabling dysfunction. Stop letting bullies have their way because it's easier than fighting back. The first winter without my help was hard on everyone, including me. I felt guilty every single morning, but that discomfort was necessary. It forced change that needed to happen. These days, our HOA actually functions the way HOAs are supposed to function, maintaining common areas, enforcing reasonable standards that protect property values, and creating a framework for neighbors to coexist peacefully. It's not perfect. There are still disputes occasionally, still neighbors who get annoyed with each other over noise or parking or whose leaves are blowing into whose yard. But there's no more tyranny disguised as rule following. No more selective enforcement designed to punish people who don't fall in line. No more stealing from the community piggy bank to fund personal luxuries. I warm my truck every winter morning now, letting it run for 15 or 20 minutes while I drink my coffee and watch the snow fall outside my kitchen window. Sometimes I see other neighbors doing the same thing and I smile. Then I grab my shovel, put on my Carhartt jacket and my insulated boots, and head outside to clear my driveway. And if Mrs. Henderson's daughter, who inherited the townhouse and lives there now with her own family, needs help clearing hers, I do that too. If the new family across the street where the Ramirez family used to live before they moved to a bigger house in Clarence is struggling with their snowblower, I help them figure it out. I help because it's the right thing to do, not because anyone expects it or demands it. I help because my neighbors are good people who would help me if I needed it. I help because that's what community actually means, and nobody finds me for warming my vehicle anymore. The story of Barbara Mitchell, HOA president turned convicted felon, became something of a local legend in suburban Buffalo. Real estate agents tell prospective buyers about it as an example of what happens when HOAs go wrong and how communities can fix themselves. Local news did a follow-up piece on the one-year anniversary of her conviction, interviewing residents about how life had changed in Meadowbrook Heights. I declined to be interviewed on camera, but I provided a written statement that they read during the broadcast. I moved here looking for a peaceful place to rebuild my life after my divorce. Instead, I found out that home isn't about the building you live in or the rules that govern your neighborhood. Home is about the people around you and whether you can count on each other when things get hard. We lost our way for a while, but we found it again. That's the real story. Miguel, ever the more outgoing one, did appear on camera. He talked about how the experience had taught him the importance of civic engagement, of paying attention to who has power in your community and how they use it. He encouraged people living in HOA communities to read their governing documents, attend meetings, ask questions, and not be afraid to challenge authority when authority is being abused. Patricia Morrison, who by then had been elected to a second term as HOA president, also spoke. She discussed the financial reforms that had been implemented, the new oversight mechanisms, and the cultural shift toward transparency and fairness. She made the point that HOAs aren't inherently bad. They just need to be run by people who understand they're serving the community, not ruling it. The interview aired on a Tuesday evening in March. I watched it from my couch with a beer in hand, feeling oddly detached from the whole thing. It felt like ancient history now, even though only 2 years had passed since that cold January morning when everything started. My phone buzzed with texts from friends and neighbors who had seen it. Miguel sent me a gif of someone saluting. Mrs. Henderson's daughter sent a heart emoji and a message saying her mom would have been proud. Even my ex-wife, who I rarely heard from anymore, sent a brief message. Saw the news story. Sounds like you found a good place after all. Take care. I did find a good place. It just took some work to make it that way. Spring came eventually, the way it always does in Buffalo. Suddenly, and with a sense of relief so profound you can feel it in the air. The snow melted, the streets cleared, and people emerged from their hibernation to start working on their yards and gardens. I planted flowers that year for the first time since moving in. Nothing fancy, just some petunias and marigolds along the front walk. I didn't check the HOA regulations to see what colors were allowed. I just planted what I liked. Nobody fined me. I sit here now, years later, in my home office writing this all down, and I can see my front yard through the window. The flowers have been replaced by different ones, season after season. The truck in my driveway is a newer model, but I still start it up on cold mornings and let it warm. The neighbors have changed. Some have moved away, new families have moved in. Life continues its inevitable forward motion. But the lesson remains. Sometimes helping people means refusing to help them in the way they've become accustomed to. Sometimes being a good neighbor means forcing your neighborhood to confront its problems. Sometimes the cost of standing up for what's right is watching people struggle while those problems get fixed. I paid my $50 fine for warming my vehicle on that bitter January morning, and in return, I got a community worth living in. I'd say that was a pretty good deal. The snow is starting to fall again outside my window now. First snow of the season. It's only November, but this is Buffalo. We get snow whenever winter feels like showing up. I'll wake up early tomorrow morning. I'll make my coffee. I'll start my truck and let it warm up for as long as it needs. Then I'll grab my shovel and clear my driveway and probably a few others while I'm at it, because that's what neighbors do. And nobody is going to fine me for it ever again.